Welcome back to Journey to Indomitus. I'll be your host, Dana Howell, and today we're going to be tackling the final army of the Indomitus Challenge, the Sisters of Battle. I've had these models prepped for quite some time now, but I've still been going back and forth on exactly how I wanted to paint them. I rolled out the bases using the cathedral style base example I put up in my recent basing video, and I did a few test models, none of which really worked for me. So it being December already, I figured let's just charge headlong into it and get all of these Sisters of Battle painted up before the end of the month. I've been playing Death Stranding lately and finishing up a lot of the endgame content. Playing through it again, I've been really noticing how much the design, especially the colors, are jumping out to me, and I'd like to take some of that influence and put it into our Sisters of Battle. Specifically, I think we're going to paint these sisters in a sort of drab navy blue color, and then highlight the points of interest on the model with yellow and warm orange-brown colors. Without further ado, let's get started. To start out, we're going to prime everything in a matte black primer. Then, to give the armor a sort of dark blue tinge, we're going to spray everything in a zenithal of Night Haunt Gloom. I found this paint wasn't super useful to me for painting ghosts, but I do find it's really great for highlighting black armor, especially when sprayed through an airbrush. For our final zenithal highlight, we're going to spray just a really light spray over top of all of our sisters of a verdigris paint. You can use whatever verdigris paint that you want. I used the one from my Green Stuff World Pigments set because I wanted to see how those pigment paints would spray through an airbrush, and it actually worked pretty well. Overall, the armor turned out a little bit brighter than I intended, but it gave me a little bit of inspiration, and I was like, oh, maybe we can more emphasize the verdigris nature of this armor in future steps. You know how much I love that oxidized copper look. After that, we're going to use a rusty orange color to paint all of the robes on the models. And the color I'm going to use today is Oculus's beard, named for the hair color of famous lore master Oculus Imperia. This is a really versatile orange-brown color, really similar, I think, to the old Snakebite leather, I think. But we're also going to use it to spray a little bit of a fire highlight over the smoldering corpse on one of the models. With our airbrushing complete, we can move straight on to our hand painting. As our first step, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Drakenhof Nightshade and Night Haunt Gloom to create sort of a dark wash glaze type paint to give the armor a little bit of extra shading in places that we feel it's either too bright or maybe we've sprayed a little bit of the robe color onto the armor. We're just going to go through and clean up a lot of the different parts of the armor and add some little bits of shading and stuff. Next, we're going to use a mix of a really dark brown color. In this case, I'm using German Camo Black Brown, and one drop of a turquoise color. In this case, I'm using the turquoise oxide from the Rust Pigment set in order to create a nice black brown color for some of the dark rusty metal parts on the units. We're going to use this to paint the casing of all of the guns, as well as like the grenades, a lot of the parts that we just want to look like equipment or metal. We can also use this color to paint all of the wood on the standard bearer's wood skeleton house thing. And we can also use this to stipple on to some of the ash of the smoldering corpse to make it look more like a pile of smoldering ash. After that, we're going to use some Vallejo model color ochre brown to paint some of the little packages on the sides of the models in a ochre brown dark yellow color. This was one of my favorite parts of Death Stranding, was that your character is almost always in these dark colors, and then on his back are always these like really bright yellow packages that your eye gets drawn to. So I wanted to incorporate that into these models, and I've painted pretty much all the parts that would be made of leather or anything that would be a piece of equipment that would have like a hazard warning on it. I think that's how I would best describe it. So we're painting the chainsword in this color, any of the little packages and packs on the sisters, we're going to paint in this color. Once that's done, this might be a good time to paint on the flesh tones of the faces of the model. These models don't have any exposed skin except for their faces, so we can just kind of have fun with it. In this squad, there are 6 units overall which have exposed faces. So I've just picked 3 different skin tones, thinned them down a bit, and then put 1 or 2 coats onto the faces. We'll apply some shading and highlights to these faces later. As we're getting to know these sisters by painting them, it's giving me this sort of vibe of an industrial setting, maybe like Necromunda-ish. And in order to really drive that home, I thought it might be fun to paint hazard stripes on the side of the chainsword of the leader figure. We're using the same black-brown color that we used for the casings of the guns, and I'm just going to stipple that onto the chainsword. It can sometimes be kind of hard to paint freehand, so I often just use dots, and I will stipple it on until it looks like a straight line, and it also gives you the bonus effect of looking like chipped paint. So don't be intimidated by freehanding, just do it 1 dot at a time, and you'll get there. Finally, we're going to bust out our old friend, Pale Sand, and we're going to do some highlights and paint all of the white parts of the model. Starting with the hair. White hair, so I'm told, is a classic look for the Sisters of Battle. So we're going to paint all of our sisters with white, really bright white hair. One of the reasons I was in favor of doing this is because it really draws your eye to the faces of the figures, because it's going to be the point of maximum contrast on the model. As we're doing this, I'm sort of painting 1 hair strand at a time and then putting a second coat of white on top of that to give a little bit of definition and texture to the hair. And I'm also trying to leave a little bit of space between painting the white on the hair and the skin to create a built-in shadow type of thing. After we're done painting the hair, we're going to wipe off some of the excess paint on our brush, and we're just going to do some really rough and dirty edge highlighting on some of the parts of the model, starting with the gun casing. I want to have an effect here that looks like chipped paint. If you just watched my previous video on kit bashing goblins, this technique is going to be really familiar to you because we just figured it out in that video. And we're just going to lightly kind of press our brush onto the parts of the gun casing we want to have this chipped paint. We're not moving our brush like this like we would with dry brushing. We're just dabbing it on and letting it catch on some of the raised edges of the gun, and some of the other things we might want to paint include other parts of the equipment that are painted in this color. And then after that, we might want to use the same technique on other things such as the chainsword of the leader figure. After that, we're going to use the same white color to paint all of the pieces of paper that are coming off of the Sisters of Battle. I know what they're called in the lore, but I like to pretend this is the sisters' homework that they just have stapled onto them so they don't forget it for their Sisters of Battle classes. We can also use the same color to paint the masks on the helmets of any of the sisters with helmets, and then of course all of the skulls. There's always some skulls. Now that we've completed the majority of our base colors, we can move on to the metallics. We're going to be using the same 2 metallics I always use in this video, Vallejo Metal Color Dull Aluminum and Copper. We're going to use these 2 paints, starting with the copper. We're going to use this copper to paint the pipes on the front of the armor, the emblems on the side, as well as a lot of different parts of the backpack, including these little rims, little buttons, all the parts of the backpack that you might expect to be copper. Aside from that, all of these sisters have a few little bits and collectibles on them that you think might be copper, so just go ahead and paint those copper because you know best which parts of your sister should be copper. After that, we're going to use our silver color to paint any of the parts of your model that you weren't brave enough to paint copper. There's no shame in this. Painting too much copper on your model can be intimidating. We can use this color to paint the front of the gun where the bullets come out, some of our prayer beads, as well as the little buttons on all of the robes. I feel this really helps those robes stand out. Once that's done, we can move on to some shading and highlights. We're going to start by shading a lot of our stuff with my favorite shade paint, Hal's Bane Curse. If you haven't watched any of my previous videos, Hal's Bane Curse is a pre-mixed wash that I make, which is just a 50-50 mix of Reikland Flesh Shade and Agrax Earth Shade. We're going to use this to shade all of the parts that need shading, including most of the metallic parts, most of the yellow parts, some of the robes, all of the little papers that the sisters did their homework on, and of course all of the skulls in the skull house. Once we're done shading to our satisfaction, we can have some real fun and bust out our weathering paints. First thing we're going to use is a verdigris paint. I'm using the one from the Green Stuff World liquid pigment set that I really like, but you could use any kind of verdigris paint. There's a lot of them. Neolac Oxide, ML Mispix Verdigris, and others. We're going to use this in a stippling manner to make all of the copper armor look like the roof of Parliament, or the Statue of Liberty, I guess, if you don't have a Parliament. We can also use this to highlight the blue armor in parts, because in my head now I'm thinking that all of the power armor used to be copper and it's just gotten covered in verdigris, like the roof of Parliament. In some parts here, I found I took this oxidization a little bit too far, and whenever I did that, I just took a little bit of our original wash of Drakenhof Nightshade and Nighthaunt Gloom, and just put it back on to tone everything down and blend it all together. As I've said many times before, with painting nothing is permanent. You can always increase your shadows or highlights, take your time and have some fun, follow your dreams. One of the techniques I've decided to use here is to actually take out our copper paint again and paint on a little bit of copper on top of some of the verdigris paint to make it look even more like a chipped verdigris roof of Parliament kind of vibe. Once we're done with all of our verdigris, we're going to use some of our more traditional rust colors to weather down some of the metal on the figures. In this case, I'm going to be using the Game Stuff World. In this case, I'm going to be using the Green Stuff World Light Rust from their Rust Pigment set to start out. And we're just going to stipple this on to any of the parts of the model that we want to have a little bit of rust, especially along the gun casings where we've stippled on that white highlights. Once we're done with that, we can use the lighter orange rust from the same set, or you can just use an orange paint if you want, to add even more variety and highlights to that rust. Once we finish doing this to all the metallic parts, I'm going to use these same two paints to do the same thing to the robes because I think it would look good. So we're going to do that. We're just going to use our stippling technique to create little random patterns at the bottoms of the robes, starting out with our light rust and moving up towards the orange rust color. Sometimes this takes several different coats, but it's really not too difficult. There's no advanced blending here. We're just splotching it on in several really thin coats. Although you don't actually have to thin these paints, they're already completely thinned down kind of glazes. Before putting these paints away, we can use the orange rust color to highlight any of the parts we want to have an orange glow, such as the eyes of the death masks, the end of the flamethrower that I forgot to tell you to paint white in the recesses before, and just any other parts you want to have a bit of an orange glow, like the cybernetic eye on the leader figure. I don't know, have fun with it. With that done, let's move on to the next step, the faces. Painting Sisters of Battle faces could probably be its own entire tutorial, so again, we're going to try and keep it pretty simple here and make this pretty easy to do in this tutorial. So first things first, we're going to wash everyone's face with Reikland Flesh Shade. No matter what the skin tone of the figure, Reikland Flesh Shade works pretty well as a nice shading technique. I've heard this explained by Vince Venturella that it's like Reikland Flesh Shade has this reddish orange tone in it, which helps simulate the blood underneath the skin or something. I don't know why it works, but it does work, so there you go. Then if we want, we could add some highlights to our skin tone, taking the original skin tone that we put on the model and just reapplying it in places like the forehead, the nose, the cheekbones, maybe the chin, the jawline. And then if we want to go a step further with these highlights, we can add just a little bit of pale sand to whatever the skin tone was and add a little bit extra to the very tops of the model's face, like the nose and the cheekbones, and maybe the forehead if there's any forehead showing. Once this is done, we might attempt to paint the eyes. For a lot of these figures, I'm just putting a single dot of white on one side to make it look like the sister is looking one way. And that's about as far as I'm going with the eyes on these figures. You can find lots of how to paint face tutorials out there, but I'm not going into it any more complicated than that. Then as a final step for a lot of these sisters, I've just given them a little bit of color in their lips. Not like they're wearing lipstick, but just like they're wearing like, you know, like a lip gloss with a little bit of color. We're just giving them just a little bit of red in their lips. And for this, I'm using actually one of the reddish rust tones from the Rust Pigments set, but you could use any dark red glaze color for this, like Cavalry Brown would work fine. So yeah, just have fun with it. At this point, if you want, you can work on the sister's homework, adding some stippling in a dark brown or black color to simulate writing on all of the sister's homework. We could also stipple this onto other parts in the armor to make it look like battle damage or like little oaths that they've written onto their armor. However, whatever you want to do. As a final step, I'm just going to dry brush the bases with dark sand and then give them an overall wash of Howl's Bane Curse. Once that's dry, we can add some variation to these cathedral bases by painting a few of the stones in some of the rust tones we might have used previously, tying the bases together with the figure. Then we can re-highlight some of the white stones in our base coat color of dark sand to help them stand out a bit more. And then we're going to rim the bases with a matte black paint. And then our sisters are done. I hope you enjoyed this video on painting my Sisters of Battle. If you liked this video, definitely give it a like and let me know in the comments what you liked about it. If you'd like to see more Sisters of Battle videos on the specialist units, I could do that too, because there's quite a variety of different units the sisters can field. And as always, before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon. This week I'd like to extend a special thank you to David and Monkey. If you'd like to become a patron and get your name up here or get access to bonus content like a deleted scene from last week's video, you can subscribe and help these videos to keep going at patreon.com/DanaHowell. Or you can follow my daily painting progress on Twitter or Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in our next video. Let me know what you want to see next. More Necrons, more sisters. I have to paint more of each of them, so let me know down in the comments which you want to see more of first. Alright. Happy Orc Fem. I mean, no, it's December now. See you later.